Welcome to day 4 of Nodevember. The challenge is weighing on me, it just takes so much time, but I'm gonna continue doing one prompt per day. I don't care if it's supposed to be easier than that. The prompt for today is adventure, and I thought what would be cooler than opening a scroll and it says a nice Tolkien quote. Before we start, make sure you have 4.1, you're gonna need it. Take everything, delete it, add in an object, geonodes, and make that a geometry nodes object. And to unroll my scroll, I may take I'm gonna take kind of a weird approach. We're gonna start with a curved line, and this is gonna be a cross section of our scroll that we're then going to extrude. Is to go straight and then kind of like curl at the bottom, and that thing can move up. And basically the way to do this is you first rotate one section and then you kind of move up the chain, then you rotate everything under it, go up, rotate everything under it. It turns out this is the way to unroll things. This is why we're using the repeat zone. And also make sure to add more points for your curve. I'm gonna use 50. I'm gonna use the set position, and this position kind of function is gonna be a bit tricky. So it's gonna be the position, but obviously we want to do some rotation or pivoting. What is the center that we're pivoting and what is the axis? The axis is pretty simple. I want to pivot on the y-axis, at least the way I'm looking at it. So that's gonna be 0, 1, 0. And then the center of this is basically going to be the point above it. In other words, we're kind of looking at the next index or something like that. To do that, I want to kind of keep a tally of the number of repetitions we're doing. So I'm making this parameter that starts off at 0, goes to 1, 2, etc. So I'm going to look at where index is less than or equal to our repetition number. And this is going to be our selection. Now to get the position of the index above what we're looking for, we can use a evaluate at index, the position. And then for the index, I think we want 1 above this. So we can actually just use this add 1 index. Maybe connect that to the center. And if I zoom in here and I change the angle, you can see it's pivoting only a single joint of this. Then on the next step, it should pivot this section. Let's see if it does that. Increase the iteration to 2, and there we go. It's going to keep furling inwards, and let's see what that looks like. However, since the rotation's kind of constant, it's not going to kind of spiral inwards because the angle shouldn't be constant. It should be growing or shrinking or something. So I'm going to take our parameter that I believe needs to be in radian, add a tiny bit of something to the angle, which now kind of gives us this curl parameter. It's almost like a way to control an octopus tentacle. We need to modify our number to be perfect. So now when we kind of unfurl this, it acts exactly as we want. And I don't want to just kind of change our iteration number freehand, because you can see it starts glitching and stuff like that. So I want a way to control this nicely. So I'm going to make a integer for the number of points. It was 50, going from A equals 1 to B equals 250. Connect that to the iteration. And now we should have a nice mixing factor, although it does kind of glitch out at it. Maybe instead we go to our point count and go to 1 minus that. And there you go. We have our scrolling animation. Thinking, Tom, this shit's so polygonal, and can't we fix that by adding more points to this instead of 50, 100? The answer is yes, but it kind of becomes unstable. So instead, I'm going to use a bit of a cheat. We're going to add a fillet curve, like a filet mignon, set this to poly, limit radius. As we increase this, you can see we are getting a smoother contour. Now, one thing I want you to notice is as we enable and disable this, we're going from 50 points to 290. Fix that. I'm going to bring this back to a mesh, and I'm going to merge by distance. And you can see if you look at the top left, this actually got rid of a lot of points. And I want to extrude it so that it's actually making a scroll by edges, and then in which direction it should be going down the y-axis. And because we're going to be accessing our animation a lot, I'm just going to make this a group input. So now we can control this outside of here. And one thing that's going to add a lot of realism is basically adding noise to the scroll. So it's kind of old and decrepit and it's not holding its shape perfectly. We're going to need a lot of geometry. You see, when we go to the wireframe, we have a lot of geometry going downwards. However, we only have a single face going this way. And because we don't have kind of a loop cut operator, please add that, we're going to need to do this ourselves. Now the repeat zone will do this for us. Extrude my mesh by the same vector. And you're thinking, what is the difference here? If I take this and divide by 2, it's going to be twice as short, but now we can make it twice as long. And I think you see the idea here. I'm actually going to make it nicer, 0.5, and we are going to divide by a integer. And then this integer is also going to be our number of iterations. So now we basically have a loop cut slider that has really glitched out Blender. Okay, it has officially crashed Blender. The reason this happened might not be obvious to you, but gosh dang it, it's obvious to me. Okay, so this time I'm going to increase it much slower so we can see what's going on here. And it doesn't seem like it would make sense that Blender crashes because it's not that much geometry. 14,000 edges, which doesn't seem correct, right? I expand this 1 more time or 2 more times, and now we're getting really up there. Everything is getting extruded, everything. And because it's overlapping, we're not able to see that it's making extra geometry. What we actually want here is that each time it extrudes, it only extrudes from the right side. It doesn't need to re-extrude this or this or this. And this is where this top parameter comes in. So I'm just going to bring that inwards and make sure that that is our selection, making sure it's initially enabled. And now when I increase this, we can do it as much as we want without any crashing. I think we can actually start distorting this. So I'm going to store named attribute. Why am I storing a named attribute? Well, what I want to do is I want to store the spline parameter. I'm going to call this spline, and I want to be able to distort it on 2 axes. The first axis is going to basically kind of be this y-axis where it's starts furling. And then the other axis I want to control is obviously the x-axis. So after we make our mesh, this is where I'm going to do our distortion by a random noise texture, which you can see kind of messes this up. First of all, I'm going to subtract by 0.5 on every axis to center this. And second of all, we want to make sure that we are scaling this by a tinier number. And honestly, it kind of looks like this works, but the reason I stored the attribute before is pretty subtle. You can see it actually changes as we move up and down, which I don't think would be realistic. Basically, the way I want to control this is for the vector, the coordinate system of our noise texture. This is where I'm going to import in our spline info. So I'm just going to connect this here, which you can see gives us kind of like a constant unfurling here. You're just going to take this and divide it by like a big number, so it's kind of not as intense. But I also want distortion on the x-axis, and I can do that by looking at the position. And again, we only care about this axis, which is staying constant to separate our x, y, z. So now you can see we have a scroll that's kind of unfurling with a constant distortion. And maybe to not get these diagonal lines that I'm seeing, maybe we want to kind of input in a vector instead of this like addition scalar so that each axis is independent. And now this kind of looks like it makes more sense to me. And I'm happy with these parameters. Okay, so last thing I want to do is I also want to store a second named attribute, and that is going to be our, I guess it's our y component. And I'm storing all these components isn't just for the distortion, it's for the material, which is going to depend on these attributes. So we're going to take the y coordinate and we're going to call this like spline 2. I'm going to set material right here. What I'm hoping to do is make our border not this perfect rectangle. I want it to kind of be distorted and jagged on the edges. So go to our material and I'm going to look at our attribute. First of all, it's going to be spline, which you see gives us one component. And then we duplicate this, make it spline 2. And now we have the other axis. If I take this and I kind of like center the distortion, so I'm going to subtract by, I guess it's 0.25. I'm going to take that and then make it symmetrical by taking an absolute value, process it through a color ramp, and then basically isolate the edges. Just up the contrast a little. And just like that, we have control of our edges. The reason I'm doing this now is I can combine our two axes, so the x and the y component, which will create a two-dimensional coordinate system. No matter how we curl it or uncurl it, it stays with it. I can make a noise texture, and now I can do the age-old trick of distorting our coordinate system. So we always use a linear light for this. Actually, I think we have these inverted. So when this is 0, we get our coordinate system, and as we increase this, you can see we're getting some distortion. What I can do is I can take this distorted attribute, so I think it is the x-axis. No, it is the y-axis. Our edge from before is like heavily distorted depending on this factor. I can up the detail and increase the roughness to create more of a like really worn, jagged edge. And then the other thing we do is basically a mirror image of this. The centering for this one should be 0.5 because it's 1 unit tall. And because this is a longer axis, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add before we do our color ramp. And you can think of this as basically like a shifting of our color ramp. And instead of like addition, which kind of creates this weird like overlapping on the corners, you can't see it, but it is the truth. You want to take maximum. So it's just going to keep the bigger of the two. If I invert this map because I want white in the center, I can plug this into the alpha, which you can think of as transparency. And if I add in a light source, you can see that this now has a jagged edge. By adding an addition here as well, we'll be able to kind of control how much it like eats into this. So you can really go for like as much distortion as you want, but you don't want to go too high or it starts really not making sense anymore. And I guess the rest of this is basically like doing our basic material, which I'm not going to get that into because I feel like that part's pretty easy. Connect that to the base color. I'm going to pick two kind of like worn out yellow colors, and we kind of like go between these using the noise texture. I think we can actually use the same one as before. So here you can see I'm really making a more high contrast map. Well, let me make it more obvious. You can see that there's some like discoloration here. You want to make sure the roughness is high because it wouldn't be very reflective if it's like an old scroll. And I guess it shouldn't be this saturated. So I'm going to bring that down a little. So there's our scroll. And the last thing I really want to talk about that isn't just basic material stuff is how did I make the text on this? Because again, it's supposed to be procedural, which seems pretty hard and it needs to be in the material as well, is we're going to use a strings to curve. Just kind of examine this. We say, let's say it's test. So there we go. We have our text. We're going to join strings because we're going to need two separate lines. So I'm going to have our first string and our second string. Our quote is like home is behind. And because I don't remember, I'll make it like adventure is behind her, but we're doing it for the memes. We are going to join these strings together, and the reason I didn't make it one string block is our delimiter, which is basically our separation between these strings should be kind of like a line break. So in special characters, we have a special character for that. And now you can see we have our thing. I'm going to center it. I'm going to fill the curve so we can actually see what's going on, and you can bring in whatever font you like. Is this procedural because a font's kind of like set in stone? That is up to your interpretation. So I'm going to join these together, and I want the text to kind of be on the scroll, so I can bring down the size so it would fit on the scroll scroll. And then of course, we also need to rotate this so it's on the correct axis. Just kind of move this until it is vaguely in the center. How do I get this text information to become part of the page in shading? Like, I don't want to just like project this onto it. I want it to be a single mesh. So first of all, I'm going to center the X. I'm also going to turn this into an n-gon. I'm going to look at the proximity to these letters in reference to the page. So what does that mean? I'm going to store named attribute. This one's going to be called text. It's going to look at the proximity to what? To basically this text. And as for whether you use points, edges, or faces, the reason I don't want to use edges is we have some of these edges in between here. Faces, I don't know, maybe that would work. I mean, let's try it. I'm going to connect that over here. Make sure to realize your instances, then it fills curves and becomes a mesh. So I'm going to bring in an attribute. The attribute was called text, and it seems to maybe work. So you can see it's kind of like outlining this text here. And if we take this and make it kind of like higher contrast, so I'm going to bring the white down, it does seem to kind of be making our text. After we do all of this distortion, we are going to need to subdivide the mesh. So I'm going to subdivide it, like let's say 2 times. The text comes out a bit clearer. Now, this isn't the way I did it originally. I used point, and the reason I used point is so that we get this outline instead of this like black text. I'm going to use points, and then because it's not a face, we're going to need higher resolution here. And the resolution of a curve you can think of as basically our resampling. So if I resample this, you can see it becomes very messy because each letter is only getting 10 points. I bumped this up to 50, and now the text is much clearer. And again, you can do one more subdivision to make the text much clearer. I'm just going to do a very basic setup. I'm going to mix using our factor, like let's say the color black, or maybe I can just like invert the factor. It might be easier. So 1 minus, and to make it less intense, I'm just going to multiply. Now, the cool thing about this is as we roll, it's basically going to get rid of it. And you're asking, why can't we see it on the outside of the scroll? That's because it's basically too far away. So we get this for free without doing any kind of casting or anything like really difficult. We want to use a normal map. So I'm going to take everything we used in the base color, connect it to the height, connect that to the normal, which you can see kind of really outlines this. And I can take the strength and bring it down, which this is without, and then this is with. It just adds some texture. Remember, you can just kind of bring in this contrast and the text will be a lot clearer. Last thing I want to say is if you want to distort this text so it's not like perfect and you want it to change over time, this is where you use your like noise thing again. So you'd basically linear light our distortion. Yeah, so you can see it becomes really like blobular and distorted. I think this noise should be like of high scale, so it's kind of like very like textured and weathered. And then to change the text, the way I was doing it is I just use this W slider. So I can take the frame number, divide by 1000, and now the text is evolving. This is our scroll. So there you go. Another day of Nodevember in the bucket, nothing but net. If you want the blend file for this, it's going to be in the description. File is my original that has all the extra stuff onto it. Remember, if you join the Patreon now, you get access to 30 blend files as I go throughout the month. And I'm alternating between Default Cube and CG Matter channel for upload. So if it looks like I skipped one, I didn't. You're just not subscribed to both. Either way, tomorrow's day 5. The prompt is lovely. And I think I'm going to take it easy for that one, but we'll still learn something. So there you go.